at the library and have a few moments of presentation. And thank you to those who are here in person or watching on Zoom. I appreciate it very much. I did want to start out by saying the first book here goes to the library with a signed edition. So I'll just give it to you now. Hopefully many people will read it over the years. A bit of background. So if you read the introduction to the book, it tells about my background. This book is called a memoir. So it's like a personal part of my life, which happens to be the aviation part, right? So I'll tell you a little bit. I grew up in rural South Dakota in the small town of Sturgis. You may have heard that, where all the motorcycle rallies are. Well, my parents owned a ranch outside of town a few miles in the local livestock auction. My father had a small plane and I flew in it a few times and liked that a whole lot. And then after high school, 10 days later, I was in the US Army as a helicopter mechanic and navigator. So I got trained to navigate low level. I'm talking low, 3 to 5 feet high for wartime experience and about 100 knots, so 115 miles an hour. Things go by pretty quickly and come up to you quickly when you're going that fast low to the ground. So it takes some training. I did that, and then after spending my time in the Army, I drove semi trucks for a year and saved my money. Then I went to aircraft mechanics school, Spartan School of Aeronautics in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And from there, I went just nearby here in Prescott, Arizona, to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And I earned a couple of bachelor's degrees there, aeronautical science, aeronautical studies, and a whole pocket full of newly minted pilot's licenses. So pilot's licenses, if you're not familiar, come in various forms. So the introductory one would be student, and then comes private pilot, where you could have your own plane and carry passengers. Then commercial, where you can be hired to fly. And then instrument flying for flying in the clouds. And then most people go on and get instructor ratings as well as multi-engine ratings. And the final top level pilot's license is called the Airline Transport Pilot's License, or ATP. And that one you have to be 23 years old and minimum and have at least 1,500 hours of flying. And each one of those levels of piloting, the written tests and the examination, both oral examination with the examiner and flight examination, are more and more thorough. So when you get to the top level of airline transport pilot, it's about like taking a senior level college class and a very encompassing exam, and then the flight exam as well. So that's a little background. My wife helped me a whole lot, Cheryl. She's sitting right there. Her aid in my being able to make the steps along to major airline pilot was, without a doubt, a big part of our success. And I have the book dedicated to her and our children in the front of the book. Frequently, she would work as a nurse and support us while I looked for flying jobs or another opportunity. I do recall that 3 times I phoned her at her new job and said I found a job in a different state. We're moving over the weekend. That's hard to take if you're a nurse. So thank you, Cheryl. We've lived here in the Silver City area for about 10 years now. We came here a couple years after I retired as a pilot and built a home, barn, have horses, corrals. I keep an airplane out at the Grant County Airport, and like most people, pay taxes. Good for the local economy, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit before we get into the book. In Silver City Life magazine, which was only out for, I think, a couple of years, it didn't make a very long go of it. I was featured there, and a local fellow who worked as a writer for the magazine, Mark Erickson, he's deceased now. He wrote an article about me and told a little about my life and that. This was before I'd written the book, right? So I thought you'd like to see about that. And then Joe Lutz, the writer for the Silver City Daily Press, came over to our home this morning and interviewed me, and there's going to be an article in the Daily Press tomorrow, so that we know the date. If you're watching this on YouTube, that would be Friday, March 3rd. So there'll be photo, I presume, information about the book and my career and some of that. So now let's talk a little bit about the book, right? So how did I get started to write it, right? I had recalled several stories or events during my career that were kind of outstanding. About 80% of the 50 flying stories in the book occurred personally to me. About the other 20% are stories that other people told me that were kind of outstanding. And I sort of just remembered those along the way. And in 2018, our son Nathan, while he was finishing his master's degree, lived with us. And I would tell Cheryl and Nathan one of those aviation stories again. And pretty soon he said, you know, Dad, you really ought to write a book. You've got enough of those, you should. So we started writing them down. And in a few months, with me telling stories, we had about 35. And in a few more months, we have 45. And then a few more months, we had like 53. And we cut it down to 50, right? So that's where they came from, just stories that I had remembered from flying. And so that you know, the book is available to purchase on Amazon, which is kind of like, in my efforts, no small feat to accomplish. And I also have a website under my name, Roth, R-O-T-H, Pilot Writer. So P-I-L-O-T and W-R-I-T-E-R. So rothpilotwriter.com is the website. And if you want to contact me and get a signed version of the book, I'd be glad to do that. Just send me an email at rothpilotwriter@gmail.com. So I have it available both ways, personally and on Amazon, where most people who purchased the book have picked it up. I thought I might talk a little bit about the writing and publishing path of the book, and then I'll tell you some of the stories.
Okay. If you know where I should start the presentation portion.
Let's do. Okay. Let's do. Go ahead. So 50 flying stories it is, and we'll make it to the view for a full screen, if you could, please. There you go. Good. All right. And this is just up there, so we're getting started. So go to the next page if you would, and we'll just keep going. So the cover photo on the book is something that took quite a bit of effort to obtain. This is of a Airbus 320, the airplane on that side of the table, during manufacturer's winter trials. So when the manufacturer makes an airplane, they have to prove it that it works properly in hot weather, cold weather, all the performance information that needs to go in the manuals and all that. And this photo was taken by a Airbus employee, photographer. And the front cover photo of the book shows this same photo, and it's copyright approved by Airbus Industries. And that took a little doing, about a year back and forth, emailing, working on it. And then I was so grateful to Airbus for being able to allow it on the cover of my book. Next slide, please. So this is the first week or two that the book came out on Amazon. And back, please. That one right there. And if you look, it says in aircraft piloting and flight instruction, not #1 release of all the books on here on Amazon, just in aircraft piloting and flight instruction. So the first couple of weeks it came out, it was the #1 seller just in those categories. Next, please. So the little wings on the front of the cover were my daughter Diana's idea. That needs wings. Okay. And if we talked about the Airbus photo, and one of the near concluding chapters, like only 2 or 3 chapters left, is somewhat related to this photo. I flew a late night flight in a blizzard from Minneapolis to Fargo, North Dakota, one night in the middle of a bad storm. And at that time, I had about 8 years of captain experience on the Airbus 320 and about 5 years of first officer experience, with a total of over 7,000 hours in that one aircraft. We went to Fargo that night and the runway was just glassy ice with a strong crosswind and very challenging conditions. The regulations now have changed where braking action reports are required, so you can know how much braking is available on a slippery, icy, or wet surface. Back in that day, they were not required at small outstations, only big airports. We landed there and it used like 7,300 feet of the available 8,000 feet of the runway to get the airplane stopped. And then the little tiller wheel, you turn with your left hand as the captain to turn the nose wheels left and right. I turned it, we were going about 2 miles an hour and the airplane just kept going straight. Slow it down to 1 mile an hour, put on the left brake and a little bit of tiller. Still going straight. Close the left throttle, open the right one, tap on the left brake, and the airplane skids around the turnoff. You know, the wind's blowing 35 miles an hour and it's snowy, the visibility is terrible. We're taxiing back to the terminal, which is like 2 miles away. You can't even see it. You can only see about a half a mile in this blizzard. And the first officer looks over at me. It was his turn to fly that flight, but I had asked him if he wouldn't mind if I would. And he looks over at me and says, "Sick landing, Captain." Thank you. Took about all the skill I could muster up to keep the airplane on the runway. So that's why the foreboding looking photo on the front cover.
So your hair wasn't gray before that?
Partly. Maybe I needed some by then. Oh. Then over on the left side here, you see that's a photo of myself with a goofy glider pilot's hat on and oxygen cannula on. And I'm competing at the U.S. Motor Glider Nationals in Parowan, Utah. And that's photos there. So there are some stories about glider flying in the book also. Next slide, please. That's my last day being in the Army. So I'm obviously the guy with a little bit too long of hair and the sergeant stripes. And the fellow I'm shaking hands with was one of our more experienced pilots, Mr. Burton. And that helicopter is the one that I cared for of many while I was a mechanic and navigator in the Army. He flew me that day up to Nuremberg so I could catch a flight to come home at the end of my time being in the service. Next slide, please. And there I am at Prescott, Arizona. with a little bit too long of hair in the day. I graduated in 81, and that was one of the school's nicer airplanes with a better paint job. And I think we had rented it that day. Cheryl and I rented that aircraft that day and took a little scenic tour. As you can see, I earned a A&P license there at Spartan School of Aeronautics, like we talked about, and a couple of bachelor's degrees, and then all the pilot's license ratings we talked about. But very little flying experience, right? Only about 250 hours of total flying experience and all those newly minted licenses. I call them ink wet for people that are still new. Next, please. My first job was as a co-pilot mechanic on this aircraft, and it's called a Beechcraft King Air 200. It would be very similar to the Advanced Air King Air 350 that you may have flown out of Grant County to Phoenix or Albuquerque. It's the same basic fuselage wing and a couple little change details, that's all. And I was able to earn my airline transports pilot's license in that aircraft. And the company I worked for was kind enough to pay for it all, which was a really nice thing. You know, that plane rents for probably $1,500 an hour, you know, and then the examiner's fee was $300 or $400 back then. I don't know how much they are now for an ATP license, plus the fuel. And so it was really nice that I worked there and they allowed me to use that plane. And most people use a small piston engine trainer type plane for their airline transport pilot rating. So it was a very nice opportunity to have a turbine powered 1,100 horsepower per side airplane to take my ATP rating in. Next, please. So this is the second airline I worked for. That's myself in front of a Northwest Airlines DC-9, one of these. And I worked, my first airline job was for Republic Airlines. You may recall, like, Hughes Air West, Southern and North Central merged and they became Republic with the goofy looking duck up on the tail, right? It was like a Canadian goose in turquoise. Okay, so I worked there for a year, and then Northwest Airlines bought Republic Airlines. So we went from 3,000 pilots to 7,000 pilots in one day, right? So here I am standing in front of a Northwest DC-9 in my first officer uniform. Next slide, please. So this was the first motor glider I owned. It's called a Stimme, S-T-E-M-M-E, made in Germany. And the goofy glider pilot's hat, baggy clothes because it's hot when you fly gliders a lot. And this is a photo at Parowan, Utah. You can see a little bit of the propeller right there sticking out. So when you hit the starter, like your car, you turn the starter engages and the propeller blades fling out. And then the motor starts and you have an airplane. And then when you shut it off, the motor in the air, you pull a brake handle, brake the propeller and position it and then close that nose cone. And now you have no drag from a propeller in a glider. So I owned that one for 4 or 5 years and I had a glide ratio of like 50-1, which is pretty phenomenal. So if you're 1 mile high, you can glide 50 miles. Long ways, long ways. So it was a lot of fun. It was quite expensive. Next slide, please. So this is in front of our home in Saline, Michigan, just west of Detroit, about 30 miles. And I think I had just checked out as captain. And that's our daughter, Diana, of course, wearing my captain's hat. She's now about 30. But it makes kind of a fun photo with the Halloween pumpkin down in the corner. Next, please. So, retired in New Mexico. And this photo was taken at the City of Rocks area down there. The retirement tummy thing is always there, I'm afraid. And one more photo, if you would. That's the one you saw in the Silver City Life magazine by Mark Erickson. And by the way, I obtained copyright permission from Silver City Life magazine editor to be able to use the photos and the information from that article. One more, and I think that's the last one. So this is the aircraft I currently own. It's called Rand's 21. And you may know where Meon, M-E-O-W-N, airport is. Rocky Creek Canyon, 35 miles in a straight line northeast of Memphis, where the fire is, up in that area. So this is parked out there. So as you can see, the front tires on the plane are kind of large, and it's a tail dragger. So it's capable of landing off field, not on paved runway. It's okay on grass or dirt. So I flew up there one nice sunny day and parked the airplane right on the runway. No one else is out there. Got out and took a photo, got back in and took off. So that's kind of a fun thing. And now I volunteer for the New Mexico Pilots Association, which we do work projects and spruce up some of the backcountry airports. We just opened another one that hadn't been opened or utilized for about 35 or 40 years. Straight line north of Gila, about 25 miles. It's called Sackatone at the Rain Creek Trailhead. So we rejuvenated that last fall. Broke the blade on my tractor working on that runway. Had to get it welded and repaired. So now let's talk about a couple of the stories in the book. Okay.
Is that a four-seater?
It's two, side by side. Cruises about 140 miles an hour. Has 50 gallons of fuel, uses 7 gallons an hour. So in 6 hours, you better be on the ground. Have an hour left. So this first story I'm going to tell you that's in the book is, I asked my wife, which story should I tell? She said, well, this one. So this is not something that happened to me, right? When I worked for the corporate department, flight department, where I got the ATP license in the corporate plane, one of the other pilots there told me this story. It was before he worked at the corporate flight department at a small place where you can like rent airplanes with a pilot. Sort of like you buy a taxi cab ride in a city, you can charter, it's called, charter an airplane, right? It includes the airplane and the pilot, and they'll take you wherever you want to go, right? It's a commercial charter, but it was on a little single engine airplane. Out of Houston Hobby Airport in southern Texas. That day, the weather was about 800-foot overcast clouds and only about 2 miles visibility. So that means instrument flying. When you take off, you have to fly the aircraft by the instrument panel instruments, right? Not by visually looking outside. So it's quite challenging right off the bat. As soon as you're airborne, you've got to go into the clouds and begin instrument flight procedures. For this particular flight, a lady had chartered the aircraft and she had her cat sitting on her lap, which she was petting, right? So this chapter is entitled 9 Lives Flies, right? So they are taxied out to take off. They get all ready to go. The lady's petting the cat, and they get cleared by the air traffic controller out of Houston to take off. They go down the runway, and when they get to about 300 feet high, I don't know what cats think, but the cat basically went berserk and started doing laps around the walls of the inside of the airplane. Not on the floor, mind you, but on the vertical walls on the side of the airplane. with all claws out, cutting up the upholstery, cutting them both up with its claws, running across the instrument panel, scratching that all up. And about the third time around, that's right when they entered the clouds. And my friend had to apply himself to fly the instruments, to fly the plane. One more time around, and he tried to grab the cat, but missed. The next time around, he opened the pilot's window. Kind of sad. But the poor kitty went right out from about 1,000 feet high, unfortunately. And then he had to deal with the lady who was screaming at him and yelling because she had lost her cat. So it was bad in all regards. In a few minutes, they had calmed down. She was done yelling at him and realized that the seriousness of the situation, and decided to turn around and go back and land at Hobby Airport, go back and park. So unfortunately, 9 Lives Flies was not a good ending for the kitty. All right. So in the book, there are various groups of chapters: piloting skills, maintenance issues, different things. But there are also 6 chapters that my editor had a smart idea and said, called them shenanigans, like funny things, right? Funny things like that. So I'll tell you one of the scariest stories, all right? So when you go to flight school, do they teach you to make a low pass down a runway that you're suspect of? Of course they do, right? So if you're flying into an airport that's not a busy, a small little airport like Whiskey Creek or Grant County, and for some reason you thought, maybe there's a deer on the runway, I'll just fly down the runway 100 feet high and take a look, climb back up, and then come back around and land. So one early morning, about 4 a.m., when I first checked out as captain on the King Air that I got the ATP license in, I had a new first officer with only a couple hundred hours total time. He could run the radio and the landing gear, but he had never flown that kind of plane before. And I wasn't very experienced either, right? So we take off at 4 a.m. in Houston, again out of Houston Hobby. The cloud conditions are about 1,200 feet overcast with 2 miles visibility, pretty low visibility, light rain, and of course, it's night, right? We take off from Houston Hobby. We're going just a 10-minute flight over to Houston Hull, a little airport, kind of like Whiskey Creek would be here in Silver City. And we shoot the instrument approach going in there, and we break out of the clouds, and I had activated the runway lights by clicking the microphone on the transmitter. 7 times in 5 seconds for high, 5 times in 5 seconds for medium, 3 times for low. I put them on high by clicking the microphone. We break out of the clouds, and in a few moments I see what appears to be runway lights on one side of the runway. They were inoperative on the other side. Well, in my airline days, we're done right there. We're going somewhere else, right? Much safer operation in the airline industry. But I was supposed to pick up one of the vice presidents of the company in about 10 more minutes, right? So there's some pressure to land and pick him up. And this is before the days of cell phones. I had no way to contact him and let him know that we couldn't land there. Could he go over to the big airport? No way. I didn't even know his name or what office he worked at. I just know what time I was supposed to be there to pick him up, you know. So we talk about it, the first officer and I, and we decide if this is the runway lights, there's either going to be pavement on this side or pavement on this side. You can't tell which side is the paved side and which side is the grassy side, right? Make sense? So we're coming in to approach and land without making a low pass, my air. And when the landing lights shone on the runway, it's Murphy's Law and we're lined up with the grass. So I have to swoop the airplane over to put it over the pavement, right? I get the throttles closed in anticipation of flaring to land. And that's the first time I realized that not only were the runway lights inoperative on one side, they were also inoperative on the first half of the runway. And now I'm 20 feet high with the throttles closed and not room to stop. Not a good situation. So the throttles on that type of airplane maybe go 6 inches to full power, and then 8 inches is way over boosted on the engines. Not good for them, right? They're several $1,000s each. At that moment, I didn't care. Took the throttles and moved as wide open as they would go. And of course, turboprop and jet engines take a few seconds to rev up. If you're not familiar, car engines, when you step on the gas, or electric car nowadays, they speed up pretty quick. But turboprop or jet engines take like 3 or 5 seconds to go from idle up to a high power setting. So push the throttles all the way up, disregarding where overboost would be, and wait. And we're going down the runway 100 miles an hour now, and it's a 3,500 foot long runway, and we're 1,700 feet down. We're going 100 miles an hour towards the tall trees at the end of the runway. The engines are starting to speed up. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, 4. Now they're powering up pretty good. 5, and they're at full power. I pull the stick back as hard as it would go, all the way to the half stop and forward 1 inch, hoping the plane wouldn't stall. The stall warning horn comes on, and we go up over the trees at the end. It was close, and it was scary too. I'm excited by then, and I yell, "Gear up!" for the landing gear to be retracted by the first officer. Nothing happens over in that seat. Nothing happens. We go a little bit further, and I say, "Flaps up, halfway." Nothing happens on that side of the seat. I reach down and put the landing gear lever up and bring the flaps up partway myself. Now we're accelerating over the tops of the trees. Stall warning horn has just gone off. It was on for quite a while. We're climbing out, put the rest of the flaps up myself, and we turn and go. There's like a racetrack pattern where pilot flies around the airport in preparation to approach to land, called the traffic pattern. We turn up and we're going downwind on the traffic pattern. It was scary. And I look over at the right seat, and the fellow sitting in the right seat is gripping the seat, and his eyes are about this big, and he's gritting his teeth. This is 45 seconds after the event, right? I look at him, I say, "Are you okay?" And he says, "No." Right? So we come back around, and I make the approach to the correct side of the lights and short back from where the runway should begin, and land and turn off. And about 10 minutes later, the vice president drives up. One of the scariest things that's ever happened to me in an aircraft. So I was fortunate not to have, what would you say, bought the farm that day. I would like to entertain questions if anyone has questions that if you'd like to ask. It's free game, you know. If you have a question, go right ahead.
I'm just curious how many private pilots have their airplanes out at the Silver City Airport.
Let's see, there's 10 plus 8, so there's 18 rental hangars out there, and I believe they're all full. The waiting list varies from 3 months to 5 years, depending on how many people are in line to get one. And then there's like 3 or 5 personal or business owned hangars out at the Grant County Airport. And then at Whiskey Creek, there's 10 or 12 also. Yeah. So there's a few.
Do you know the history of the airport off of 90? What's the name of it?
Turner, yes,
You know,
Turner Ridge
history.
Airport or Airport.
Yeah.
It has been decommissioned for several years now. And Mr. Turner at one time used it for their personal aircraft. And then it's moved over to running constructions on the other side of the highway there. You may know there's a dirt runway up there, but it's now being occupied by trucks and construction equipment. So neither one of those are in use, but Turner Old Airport does have steel posts driven into the ground the length of the runway every few hundred feet. I flew down and looked at those one day, just thinking, well, if I ever really needed an airport, maybe I might need to land there. So I'll look. Well, not good. Steel posts in the middle of the runway.
Some Google Maps still show Turner Airport.
Yes, yeah, they would. And this Saskatoon Airport up by Rain Creek, north of Gila, still shows there. It will be coming back on aeronautical maps, or called sectional charts, here shortly. I also have a drone business where I fly drones and do photography and work like that, mostly for realtors here in the local area. Transitioning is super easy because if you already have a pilot's license, you're grandfathered in to knowing the airspace requirements of where you can fly and can't fly. So this presentation today will be on YouTube, the library's YouTube channel, I presume before long. And I think that's all I have today. Unless people have more questions, please do.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing process, how you got started? Did you hire a professional
Okay.
editor, proofreader?
Thank
editor,
you
all that?
for bringing that up. So my son, wife, and I were talking about, Dad, you really ought to write a book. And I'd been kind of thinking about it for a while. And then eventually we got over 50 stories. And I wanted a book that would help people and be good for our family history, both, right? And there's a fellow named Ernest Gann, Gann, who wrote one of the most widely read aviation books in US literature history called Fate is the Hunter. And he wrote a book with about 50 flying stories in it, only his were all as scary as that one I just told you. He was a co-pilot on a small piston engine twin at the beginning of World War II. And 90 days later, he was flying a huge 4-engine transport going all over the world with the first officer that had basically no experience and an engineer on his first trip every time. Right, so he wrote all these scary stories, and it was very engaging, and that became the most widely read, both hardbound and paperback aviation book ever, right? I thought, well, I could write like 50 of these stories and write a book that would be interesting and maybe it'll sell, right? So I started out just writing the chapters. I wrote them longhand with a pen. I don't know, that's kind of like an old-fashioned thing nowadays, but hold the pen, think, write a few sentences, hold the pen, think, write a few sentences. And that pretty much took me all my spare time of an entire winter. 5 months of 15, 20 hours a week to write it all out longhand. Then the next winter, I typed it all, right? So I'm not a very fast typer, obviously. And it took quite a while to get it all typed and organized and into different categories and that. And then I started looking for an editor, right? So I ended up hiring an editor who was a English literature professor at the University of Miami, tenured professor with 11, 12 years experience at the university. And she had aviation background in previous editing. So that fit me perfectly, right? So we went back and forth for a few months, right? Editing chapters at a time. She thought of the fun thing called shenanigans for some of the fun chapters. So now I had a book ready to go, but no place to publish it. As you may know, it's quite difficult or encumbering to publish your first book, unless you are J.K. Rowling or someone who is a very well-known author, right? So even the first books for some of those people are difficult. So what happens is the bigger publishing companies won't even look at your book unless you have an agent, right? So then I began to pursue an agent. Well, I spent 4 months of 5 hours a week trying to get an agent. Nobody would take it, right? I couldn't get an agent, right? So then that drops you down from the A list of book publishers to the B list. Well, the B list or C list, somewhere in there. You do a pay partial of the cost. So it's a cooperative agreement, right? Where the publisher agrees to take some of the expense on and you take some of the expense on, and then you share the royalties after the book becomes available to sell, right? So I hunted and I ended up having 5 or 6 offers from cooperative agreement publishers. And the one I went with is called Hellgate Press in Oregon. And they were really easy to work with, had a middle of the line or lower price than some of the other publishers. And I really liked talking to the guy with email and on the phone a couple times. So I agreed to publish it through them. So will this book ever be a financial success? I don't know. I don't really care, right? It would have to sell somewhere in the 3,000 copies to break even, right? For what I've invested in it, not counting any of my time. But what I'm after for is at the end of every chapter in this book, there is a moral of the story. For example, did you learn to do a low pass at flight school? Right? Any runway that's suspect, always do a runway inspection low pass. Moral of the story. When you carry an animal on board an aircraft, it should be in an enclosed container that is secured to the aircraft, right? Not loose, right? So each one of those 50 stories in there has a moral of the story or a learning lesson. And hopefully some young upcoming pilot will pick up this book and prevent crashing an airplane one day. That'd be really awesome. You know, if I could help some young person to be safer. And then it leaves a nice legacy for our family too. Yeah.
I have a question.
Please.
Do you have any advice for people who have flight anxieties? You know, like
Yes.
we're in this metal thing in the air and it's just going to drop, you know, that sort of thing.
Interestingly enough, planes don't, quote, drop, right?
Yeah, just-
They ride the air currents, right? So if the air is going up, they go up. If the air is going down, they go down. If you're going 500 miles an hour through that air, it's called turbulence, right? So jet airplanes all cruise at about the same speed, about 500 to 550 miles an hour. They all take off and land about the same speed, around 120 to 130 miles an hour. The most anxious time for passengers, I'm sure, is the takeoff, but more importantly, probably the landing, right? So when you are flying on a commercial plane the size of these planes, you would be amazed at how well-trained and experienced the pilots are, right? That makes all the difference. Like 97% of all aviation accidents are whose fault? The pilot, right? Just like your car doesn't wreck itself in the garage when no one's driving it, right? When you get in a wreck in your car, who was behind the wheel? You were, right? So there are ways to relieve your anxiety. You can take online courses that will explain how the aircraft works, right? You could go to the airport and talk to some of the pilots and look at their plane. You know, planes make a lot of funny noises, whirring sounds and clunking sounds and loud engine sounds. The flaps move, the landing gear, they all make lots of strange noises. But actually, those noises are good, right? When it's time to put the landing gear down, you want to hear that clunk, right? So if you look at it from that point of view. And then sometimes when I was a pilot for the major airlines, one of my favorite things was when a passenger would come and talk to us in the cockpit prior to departure or after the flight. But the anxious flyer who is kind of worried about this, if you learn a little bit about airplanes and talk to other pilots and read about the safety of how safe it actually is, and then maybe step in, ask the flight attendant if you can step into the cockpit and talk to the pilot a couple minutes, before departure. That seems to help quite a few people. I got a little file of funny cartoon characters kids drew for me, and here's Mr. Pilot, thank you. That's always cute. Anyone else?
You can't do that anymore though, can you?
You can before and after the flight, but not en route.
Yeah. I didn't think you could do it anytime anymore.
You can. It would be wise to ask the flight attendant if you could have a moment to step into the cockpit. And if they are busy, they'll say no. And I've done that several times. But generally, you're not too busy. You have a couple extra minutes before departure, just invite them in. And the little kids, they're this tall and they're looking up going, look at all the buttons and knobs, but you have to realize you don't push all those at once. It's a very methodical thing, one at a time, and you do it over and over and over, the same every time, basically. So as you learn bigger airplanes, you just add a couple more buttons and then a couple more systems. You went from airplane that wasn't pressurized to pressurized, and one that has de-icing and the one you had before didn't, and now multiple air conditioning systems or hydraulic systems. You keep learning that as you progress as a pilot. And by the time you get to that level, it's really pretty easy. It would be as easy for me while I was current and working for the airline to fly a big airplane like that from Denver to Los Angeles as it would be for you to get in your car and drive from here to Los Angeles. Really no more difficult. You're just used to doing it. Yeah. So it's actually amazingly safe. I know you've heard that many times, but it is. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
What was your favorite thing to fly?
Favorite thing to fly? I flew an aircraft called a Falcon 10. It's a French aircraft called Falcon, and they made different models, 10, 20, 30, 50, 300, 500. But the 10 is a little airplane that goes fast. So it's like the size of a small Learjet, but it has more swept-back wings. It can actually go faster in cruise. And the landing gear on most airplanes is rigid with the wheels straight down like that and a shock absorber in the middle. Well, this had trailing link landing gear that folds back like this and has a shock absorber here, right? And I flew a few other airplanes that had trailing link landing gear. That's the sweetest one. Then when you land, it kind of gives, like that. So plus you could allowably in the pilot's operating handbook have the gear down, the flaps full, and the speed brakes stood up on top of the wing all at the same time. Most jets, you can't do that. You can't do the speed brakes while you have the gear down and the flaps down. It would come down 20,000 feet a minute like that with the throttles at idle. We're hauling freight, so the freight doesn't care. So sometimes we just do what the plane could do just for fun, so come right up to the airport and go, and but that's not with passengers. You start way back here and make a gradual descent normally. But so it was faster than the Learjet, had trailing link landing gear, and you could do the steep descent, which was kind of fun once in a while. If air traffic control held you up, couldn't let you down because of other traffic, you could still get down. So that made it nice. Yeah. And the overhead panel had the flat section But it also had the outboard ones tipped in a little bit to the pilots. Instead of the whole thing being flat, they were angled so you could see the switches easier, right? That made it nice. It would go Mach 0.89, 89% the speed of sound, where Learjets go like only 87%. Not much difference. Airliners cruise around 82 to 86% the speed of sound. Right? They pretty much all go that same speed, jet airplanes, unless it says fighter. Anyone else?
So I'm curious, in your Army helicopter days, what were you doing at 3 to 5 feet?
Yeah.
Oh, that's an excellent question. So our company of men in helicopters were tasked with tank hunting. That's what we were specialized at. So we would operate the forward aircraft I flew on, the gunship that would do the shooting, and behind him, a Huey full of like almost Green Beret trained guys, right? So we were going around the hills, over the fences, around the train, pop up and take a look and run
Yeah.
away. And a minute later, the attack helicopter would come with the sun behind him and go shoot and gone. And if anything went bad, the Green Beret guys were supposed to clean up the mess. Fortunately, I didn't have to do that in wartime. It was just after Vietnam. But the job I held in the Army, the average person who had that job in Vietnam lived 3 days. After they got trained in the US, went in country to Vietnam and got trained and began work. The average guy lives 3 days. It was really pretty sad, And I had a couple of pilots that I flew with that lived a whole tour, 6 months through Vietnam, doing that same thing, where the average guy lived 3 days. They were exceptionally talented when we'd go play war games compared to the other guys who were new. There was just like night and day difference between that skill level, between the experienced guys and the not so experienced. So we were sneaking around and popping up, taking a look and running. That's what we did. So you learn on a course that's controlled, where everything is monitored along like a 10-mile long course, and you pre-fly it to make sure there's no new objects or obstructions or things that will surprise you. And then you start out at about 300 feet high, and you learn to navigate 300 feet high, and then 200 and 100, and then finally you get down to that 3 to 5 feet. It's quite a ride.
Yeah.
Everything you're going over, buildings, power lines, lakes, hills, trees, 3 to 5 feet high. So it was quite an experience for a 18-year-old.
Yeah.
That was daytime only, or did you guys have night vision at that point?
There was no night vision available, and we weren't allowed to do it below 300 feet at night. Right, but we never even trained for it at night. It was so dangerous. In actual wartime, we would be going at night, mostly always at night, right? And a low moon with very little light at night, and then protect your night vision. Sure.
Well, you said you did a competition for the gliders. What did the competition look like?
So in my book, there are a few chapters about glider flying, and a couple of them are on records that I attempted to and did set for state level records. You have to realize I am not a national competitor or a real high level glider competitor pilot. I just kind of did it for fun, right? And it gave me a challenge to do. And it's quite challenging. It's difficult, right? We have to really work at it, which made it fun to fly in the plane in the motor glider. So I earned a few state records in the state I was from, South Dakota. Well, that kind of sounds impressive until you realize no one else has ever set one. I set 8 or 10 of them, right? And they're still standing, but you know, it takes the right aircraft and some skill. Now, after I'd only owned the motor glider, the first one that glided at 50-to-1 ratio, only about 6 months, I was minimally qualified to go to the national level competition because I had set state records in my state. Oh boy, right? And so I only had about 300-400 hours total of glider flying, motor glider and competition flying for records only. And I went to the national championships for motor gliders in Parowan, Utah, and entered that thinking, well, this will be a real learning experience. It was. You know, I got there and my data logger wouldn't work. And I'm watching these other guys that are going, you know, 800 kilometers in one day with the motor off. And I'm able to do 200. You know, it's like, this is a whole different league, you know. And there were several people like me that were there, that were the bottom feeders, that were trying to learn and get better and such, but I wasn't a national level competitor. It was still a lot of fun, right? And you probably know of thermals, rising columns of air. They sort of look like a piece of broccoli or cauliflower if it was standing on its stem and would go up like this. So air is rising and you circle in the rising air and climb. And then you go straight till you find another thermal and then you circle and climb. So it's a slow process of glide, climb, glide, climb, glide, climb. And you can make forward progress doing that in a glider, right? So I think it was the second or third day of the Parowan Motor Glider National Championships. Our son came to visit me and went with me for the morning. Well, it's kind of hard to say, but he ralphed 8 times in the first hour, circling, all that circling. Finally, at the end of that, he said, Dad, I just can't do it anymore. I said, okay, I understand. We're done for today. And we just went back to where we took off. Poor guy, you know, oh, he had a terrible day, but he was a trooper for trying. And frequently glider flying is hot, right? So I'm pretty tolerant to high temperatures, not too good at low temperatures. But inside the cockpit, you're in there, everything's hot, and they close the plexiglass canopy right over you. Now it's like a hothouse to grow plants in, right? And as soon as you take off, the air starts coming through the vents and it gets considerably cooler. But for the first 2 or 3 minutes, it might be 120 degrees in there on a hot day. And then, you know, it might be down to 100 by the time you get 1,000, 2,000 feet high. But once you get up to 8,000 feet above the ground, now it's like 70, right? But you just have to endure that first 15 or 20 minutes usually, right? Small planes don't have air conditioning, right? Fortunately, they have heaters, right? Kind of like early cars had heaters, no air conditioning. That answer your question?
Yeah.
All right. Anyone else? No? Well, thanks for coming today. And again, thank you to the library for being here. I appreciate it.